Have you ever stood at a crossroads where everything you once believed in suddenly feels like a lie? Where the person you trusted most in the world walked away, and with them, they took the future you had planned for. I was 40 when it happened, the betrayal that would break me and rebuild me all at once. But how do you move forward when the life you knew is nothing more than a pile of shattered dreams? How do you find yourself when you don't even recognize the person staring back at you in the mirror? This is the story of how I did it. How I found a way to rise again. Piece by broken piece. Asterisk. My story begins on a crisp fall morning in 1975. I was born in a small town in upstate New York, where the trees painted the streets orange and red every autumn. The town had its own charm, quaint little houses, people who waved at each other as they passed by, and the kind of peace that only small towns can offer. My parents, Elizabeth and Thomas, were both hard workers. My father worked as a mechanic in the town's only garage, and my mother, Elizabeth, worked as a nurse at the local hospital. We weren't wealthy, but we were never wanting. Our lives were filled with love, hard work, and the simple pleasures of family dinners, weekend picnics, and homemade pies. It was the kind of life people would envy without realizing how little they actually needed. Growing up, I learned early on that life didn't come easy. My parents worked long hours, and I often had to help my mother around the house or babysit my younger brother. But there was a rhythm to our life, a routine that made everything feel normal and, in a way, safe. But nothing lasts forever. When I turned 10, everything started to change. My mother became ill, and the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. She spent more time in the hospital than at home. And I spent more time taking care of my younger brother, Kyle. It was a time of uncertainty, of seeing my mother, once a vibrant, strong woman, slowly fade away. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening, staring at my mother's empty chair. My father, who was usually quiet, seemed more distant than ever. "We'll be okay," he would tell me. But even at that young age, I could tell he didn't believe it. The house felt smaller somehow, and the weight of everything, my mother's illness. My father's exhaustion pressed down on me. When I was 13, my mother passed away. It was the kind of pain that no one can prepare you for. The house felt empty, and my father, who had always been my rock, seemed to crumble under the weight of grief. I remember the funeral. It was small, family and a few close friends, but it felt like the whole town was mourning with us. And in the midst of it all, I realized something important about myself. I wasn't the kind of person to fall apart. I was the one who held things together when everything else fell apart. It wasn't a conscious decision, but I knew I had to step up for my father, for my brother, and for myself. Life didn't get easier after that. My father had a hard time keeping the garage running without my mother's steady support. He became more withdrawn, spending long hours at work trying to make ends meet. I started working part-time at a local diner to help with bills and save money for college. Despite the challenges, I did well in school. I dreamed of leaving this small town for something bigger, something more. I wanted to go to college, get a degree, and find a life outside of the confines of my hometown. But as the years passed, realized that getting out wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. I wasn't just facing financial challenges, was facing the realities of growing up. I began to notice how different things were for me compared to my friends. They had the support of two parents, a sense of stability I couldn't quite grasp. I started to feel the weight of my responsibilities more keenly. The dreams I had of leaving and making something of myself began to feel more distant. Still, I didn't give up. I worked hard in school, kept my head down, and saved what I could. And then, just when I thought things were beginning to fall into place, I received a scholarship to a university in New York City. It was my chance to escape, to build the life I had always dreamed of. But there was one thing holding me back. My father. He was still struggling with the loss of my mother. His health had started to deteriorate, and I couldn't bring myself to leave him behind. I chose to stay home for another year to help him get back on his feet. That year was a turning point for me. I realized that life was never going to go the way I planned, but that didn't mean I had to give up on my dreams. I knew that someday I would leave this town and make something of myself. But for now, my family needed me, and so I stayed. I worked, I helped my father, and I prepared myself for the future. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. As time passed, I learned that life wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about making the best of the moments you had. But the real challenge came when I turned 18. I left for college in New York City, leaving behind everything I had known. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. I was alone in a city that never slept, surrounded by people who seemed to have it all figured out. But I was determined to succeed as I settled into my new life. I met new people, made new friends, and faced challenges I had never anticipated. The transition was hard, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter for me. And in that new chapter, I learned something important about myself. I was stronger than I ever realized. No matter what life threw my way, I could handle it. Asterisk, the transition to college life was a whirlwind. New York City, with its constant energy and infinite possibilities, was overwhelming, exhilarating, and at times isolating. I had always been someone who could manage things on my own. But being in such a vast city where no one knew my name or cared about my past made me feel small. I wasn't used to being invisible yet here. I felt like a speck in a sea of millions. My first semester was a blur of lectures, assignments, late-night coffee runs, and roommate dramas. But it was also a time of discovery. Realizing that the girl who had stayed home for years helping her father could now stand on her own 2 feet. Away from everything she had known, every class, every new book. Every conversation with someone from a different part of the world stretched my mind in ways I hadn't thought possible. However, despite the excitement, loneliness crept in. I missed home, the familiarity of the small town, the scent of pine trees, the comfort of my father's voice. I missed knowing that there were people around who cared about me without question. I had no one here to ask if I'd eaten lunch, no one to remind me to call home. I threw myself into my studies to avoid facing these feelings. But they never quite went away. The loneliness was the hardest part of being away from home. But it wasn't the only challenge I faced. The pressure of performing academically was constant, and the fear of failure lurked in the back of my mind. I had always been an overachiever, but here at this prestigious university, I was just one among thousands. The fear of not living up to expectations, of being just another face in the crowd, weighed heavily on me. I worked hard, keeping a tight grip on my grades and my future. But it often felt like I was drowning in the sheer volume of work, the intensity of my classes, and the constant competition. But in the midst of all the chaos, I met someone who would change the course of my life forever. His name was James. We met at a campus event, a seminar on global economics that neither of us had any particular interest in. But we were both looking for an excuse to avoid studying for mid. He was funny, sharp, and easy to talk to. We hit it off immediately, spending hours talking about everything from books to politics to our dreams for the future. He had a way of making everything feel light, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't drowning. We spent the next few weeks in constant conversation, and before long, we started dating. James was everything I thought I wanted: charming, ambitious, confident. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But as our relationship deepened, so did the complexities of being with someone in a city where both of us were figuring out who we were. I loved him. But there was a growing tension between the woman I was becoming and the woman I had been back home. James came from a wealthy family, one that had high expectations for him to succeed. His life had been mapped out for him, from the career he would have to the places he would go. I, on the other hand, had fought for every step I had taken to get here. Our differences weren't just about money. They were about how we approached life, our ambitions, and how much we were willing to compromise to keep our relationship intact. The cracks in our relationship started to show a year after we had been together. As graduation neared, we began to drift apart. James was obsessed with his future, constantly talking about his next big move, an internship in London, a job in finance, the world at his feet. But my dreams were different. I didn't have a clear path like he did. My dream wasn't about a career that could be summed up in a few words. It was about finding fulfillment in the little things, the connections I made, the people I helped, and the life I was building for myself. James didn't understand that. He couldn't see beyond the career path he had envisioned for himself. The more he focused on his future, the more I felt like I was being left behind. He couldn't see that I needed more than just his presence in my life. I needed to feel like I was contributing to something meaningful. And the more I pushed for that, the more he distanced himself. It wasn't long before I found out the truth, the one thing I had been dreading all along. I came home early one afternoon, intending to surprise him with a special dinner. But when I walked into our apartment, I was the one who was shocked. There he was, with another woman, laughing, their bodies too close for comfort. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. The betrayal stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. I didn't scream, didn't cry. I just stood there, frozen, watching the life I had tried to build crumble in front of me. James, of course, apologized immediately. He said it was a mistake, that he didn't know how it had happened. But I had seen it the way he looked at her, the way his attention shifted when I walked in. The trust was gone. The relationship I had invested so much in had turned into nothing more than a mirage. A fleeting illusion that shattered the moment I confronted him. I left that night. I didn't want to be there when the words were said, when the excuses came, when the blame shifted. I just left. The next few weeks were a blur of emotions. I tried to make sense of what had happened, to understand why I had been blindsided by someone I had trusted. But no matter how many times I replayed it in my mind, I couldn't find an answer. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the realization that I had placed my happiness in someone else's hands. I had let myself believe that my worth was tied to someone else's approval. And once I came to that realization, it became clear. I had to learn to find my own worth again. Not in a relationship, not in someone else, but in myself. It wasn't easy. I cried more than I cared to admit. Spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had let myself fall so hard. But over time, the pain started to fade. I started focusing on myself, on rebuilding the parts of me I had let go of for so long. I returned to my studies, threw myself into new projects, and rediscovered my love for writing. I started making decisions that were for me, not for anyone else. I found strength in my independence. The weeks following the breakup felt like a long, slow walk through a dense fog. The weight of the past loomed over me, but I was beginning to see the first signs of light breaking through the clouds. Every day, I forced myself to take small steps toward healing. Steps toward reclaiming the parts of myself I had abandoned. But it wasn't an easy journey. At times, I felt as though I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into the abyss, unsure if I could take another step. But I did, every time, one step at a time. The first thing I did was move out. I couldn't stay in that apartment, not with the memories of what had been of the life I thought I was building. I found a small place in a quiet part of the city, far from the college campus and the places I'd once frequented with James. It was a fresh start, a new space for me to breathe and rebuild. The apartment was simpler. One bedroom, unit with wooden floors and light streaming through the windows. It felt bare at first, just a shell of a home, but over time, I made it mine. I hung photos on the walls, arranged my books and knickknacks, and filled the air with the scent of candles and fresh flowers. Slowly, it became a space that was all me. And it gave me the quiet I needed to heal. But even in the stillness of my new apartment, I couldn't escape the pain. Every time I picked up my phone, I saw his name. Every time I went to a cafe, I remembered how we used to spend hours there, laughing, talking about our futures. I tried to distract myself by getting lost in books, by going for long walks in the park, by reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in a while, but the truth remained. I was hurt, and I needed to confront it. The breakthrough came when I decided to go back to what had always given me purpose: my art. I had always loved to draw, to create, but I had put it aside when I started my relationship with James. It was as though, in giving him so much of my time, I had forgotten the joy of creating something for myself. Now, in the quiet of my apartment, I picked up my sketchbook again, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of joy. I spent hours drawing, losing myself in the strokes of my pencil, the colors on the canvas. It felt like coming home to myself, but creating art wasn't the only thing I rediscovered. During my healing process, I also found a deep love for teaching. I had always been passionate about helping others. But it wasn't until I started tutoring local students that I realized how much fulfillment it brought me. I joined a local community center offering free tutoring to underprivileged kids. It was a small way to give back, but it felt big to me. Every time I saw a student's eyes light up when they grasped a concept, I felt like I was making a real difference. The sense of purpose that teaching gave me was immeasurable. I found myself working on my art during the evenings and weekends, and during the day I taught, volunteered, and worked on my small business idea. I had been toying with the idea of selling my artwork, but I was terrified of rejection. What if no one liked it? What if no one bought anything? But slowly, I began to sell a few pieces. I started with local art fairs, then created an online shop where people could view and purchase my work. The first sale came as a shock. Someone from across the country had bought one of my pieces. It was the beginning of something new, something I hadn't allowed myself to dream of before. But it wasn't just the art that changed MIT, it was also the people I reconnected with. One day, I met Sarah, a fellow artist at one of the art fairs. We hit it off immediately, and she became one of my closest friends. Sarah had been through her own heartbreak, and together we shared stories of loss, pain, and how we were rebuilding. She introduced me to a community of other artists and creators who were also working to reclaim their lives after hardships. With them, I learned that I wasn't alone, that there were people out there who understood what it was like to start over, to rebuild, and to find joy in the journey. By the time a year had passed since the breakup, I was a different person. I had learned to love myself again, to find strength in the things I was passionate about. And though the road had been painful, it had led me to a place where I could finally breathe and be at peace. My business had grown, and I had gained a newfound confidence in my ability to take risks, to create, and to trust in myself. I had also reconnected with my family. My parents, who had always been there for me, had been a quiet source of strength during this whole process. They never judged me for my choices. Instead, they supported me in every way they could. And through the conversations I had with them, I realized that I wasn't defined by the mistakes I had made or the relationships that had fallen apart. I was defined by how I rose from the ashes. The turning point came one night when I was sitting on my small balcony, watching the sunset. My phone buzzed and I saw a message from Daniel. It was simple, just 2 words. I'm proud. It hit me like a wave. The realization that my son had been with me every step of the way. He had watched me falter and fall, and yet he was there to see me rise again. With that message, I knew that everything had changed. I had gone from a woman broken by betrayal to a woman who had built something solid, something real. I had found my strength again, rediscovered my purpose, and, most importantly, learned to trust myself. The journey had been long and hard, but it had also been worth it. Now looking back, I realized that the betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my true story. The story of a woman who had to lose everything to find herself again. The story of a woman who had learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to gain everything. And for the first time in years, I could say with confidence, I am enough.